Alexander Hayes staggered out of the boardroom of the Hayes International Hotel Group, his polished leather shoes catching on the carpet as a sudden wave of dizziness struck him, and the glittering view of the Boston skyline blurred before his eyes. He gripped the doorframe, his knuckles white, as his assistant Julia Adams rushed to his side asking, "Mr. Hayes, are you all right?" Alexander forced a faint smile, waving her off and muttering that he just needed some air, though he knew that wasn't the truth. These spells had been haunting him for weeks, sudden lurches in his chest, a haze clouding his mind, moments where the world tilted like a ship in a storm, and though he had brushed it off as exhaustion from running an empire, the attacks were worsening. He quietly ordered Julia to call Dr. Miller, his tone clipped so none of the board members nearby could overhear, because weakness was something Alexander Hayes, billionaire hotel magnate, could never afford to show. Julia nodded quickly, already, reaching for her phone, while Alexander steadied himself and stepped into the elevator. The mirrored doors reflected a man who appeared invincible in his tailored navy suit with a square jaw and piercing green eyes. But inside he felt like a clock winding down. The private hospital in Boston was a gleaming fortress of steel and glass, built for the elite, and Alexander had been there before 3 months earlier when the first dizzy spells began. At that time, Dr. Miller dismissed them as stress, prescribed rest, and sent him home. But now, as Alexander sat on the edge of a leather chair in the consultation room, the air felt heavier and thick with dread. Dr. Miller entered, his face calm, but his eyes betraying unease. Holding a tablet as he reviewed the results, he spoke steadily, telling Alexander that the scans revealed a degenerative neurological condition, aggressive and incurable, and that he might only have 3 years left, perhaps less. The words hit Alexander like a blow to the chest, and his breath stalled as his mind struggled to process the impossible. At 38, he was in his prime, at the peak of his power, having built an empire that spanned continents and made his name synonymous with success. And now suddenly, he was a man counting down his final days. He asked if the diagnosis was certain, and Dr. Miller assured him it was, explaining that the symptoms of dizziness and fatigue were consistent, and that while progression could be slowed, there was no cure. Alexander leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling as regret, fear, and rage crashed together inside him. He had always believed he had time to expand, to crush rivals, to live without limits. But what cut deeper than his mortality was the thought of his legacy dying with him. He had no heir, no child to carry his name, and the idea of his reckless half-brother Marcus Hayes inheriting everything filled him with fury, because Marcus would squander the empire in months. "What are my options?" Alexander demanded sharply, and Dr. Miller explained that while there were medications and therapies to slow the condition, he needed to think about his priorities and decide what mattered most. Alexander's gaze drifted to the window where the Boston skyline shimmered in the afternoon sun. For so long, his only priorities had been money, power, and control, but now, staring at the finite span of his life, the hollowness was undeniable. He had no family, no heir, and nothing to pass on. "I need an heir," he whispered to himself, his voice filled with resolve. Dr. Miller hesitated and warned that this was a serious decision, that it wasn't just about finding someone, but about trust and compatibility. Alexander cut him off, standing tall, adjusting his suit and masking the tremor in his hands, insisting he would handle it and that this information was to remain private. Without waiting for a response, he left the office, his mind already racing with plans to secure his legacy before time ran out. That evening, in his glass-walled penthouse overlooking Boston Harbor, Alexander stood with an untouched glass of whiskey in his hand while the city stretched endlessly beneath him, vibrant and indifferent to his private storm. Dr. Miller's words replayed in his head, every syllable a blade, and the thought of having only 3 years left pressed down on him like a weight he could not escape. He had always believed he was untouchable, yet now he felt like a man standing on a crumbling cliff. His phone buzzed with Julia checking in, asking if he needed anything, and he lied, telling her he was fine while ordering her to cancel the next day's meetings because he needed time. Time felt like a cruel joke, for he had built towers of glass and steel. But what would any of it matter if it all crumbled with him? His eyes fell on a framed photo of his late mother laughing with him on a beach when he was a boy, a rare glimpse of warmth in his otherwise cold life. He poured the whiskey down the sink, straightened his shoulders, and picked up his phone again. Tonight there was a charity gala at the Seabreeze Hotel, one of his own properties, and though he had nearly canceled, the thought of being alone with his thoughts was worse. He needed a distraction, or perhaps something greater, a spark that would remind him he was still alive. The ballroom of the Seabreeze Hotel shimmered with chandeliers, the air alive with music, laughter, and the clinking of crystal glasses. A sea of tailored suits and glittering gowns filled the space as Boston's elite mingled, trading smiles and secrets under the warm glow of lights. Alexander Hayes entered with his usual commanding presence, his broad shoulders and sharp gaze drawing attention. But tonight the tremor in his hand reminded him of the storm inside. He nodded to investors, politicians, and socialites, but his mind was elsewhere, circling Dr. Miller's words like a predator. He had come here not for pleasure, but for distraction, and perhaps without knowing it, for a spark of something he couldn't name. The crowd's hum broke when a sudden crash echoed across the ballroom. A tray of wine glasses shattered against the polished floor, the red liquid splashing across Alexander's crisp white shirt. Gasps rippled through the crowd as a young waitress dropped to her knees, scrambling to pick up the shards. Her dark hair was tied in a messy bun, strands falling. Into her flushed face, her hazel eyes wide with panic. "I'm so sorry," she stammered, her hands trembling as she reached for the broken glass. "I didn't see you there." Alexander crouched beside her, his deep voice calm and almost amused. "It's just a shirt," he said, handing her a fallen napkin. For a moment their fingers brushed, a fleeting touch that sent an unexpected jolt through him. The crowd waited for the billionaire's fury, but Alexander simply smiled. The young woman looked up at him, still flushed with embarrassment yet holding a spark of defiance. "You're not angry? Most men in your position would be demanding my job right now." A rare chuckle escaped Alexander's lips. "Most men in my position don't know how to laugh at themselves." He rose to his feet and extended a hand. She hesitated, then placed her calloused palm in his, firm and unafraid. "What's your name?" he asked, his green eyes holding hers. "Clare Bennett," she replied, straightening her apron. Her voice was steady now, though her cheek still burned. "And I really am sorry. I'll pay for the dry cleaning." "Forget it, Clare," Alexander said, her name rolling off his tongue as if it belonged there. "Just keep the glasses off the floor and we're even." She nodded, a flicker of gratitude in her eyes, before hurrying back toward the kitchen, leaving Alexander staring after her. The crowd resumed their chatter, but Alexander barely noticed. Something about her lingered in his mind. The honesty in her eyes, the tremble in her hands that did not stop her from cleaning the mess, the refusal to grovel despite her mistake. Clare Bennett was unlike the women who usually hovered around him, their smiles too polished, their intentions too obvious. She was raw, real, unguarded, and for the first time in years, he felt a flicker of life that wasn't tied to business or power. A mocking voice pulled him from his thoughts. "Well, well, brother. A little wine bath? Losing your edge?" Alexander turned to see Marcus Hayes, sauntering across the room, his slicked back hair and overly flashy suit making his smirk all the more irritating. "What do you want, Marcus?" Alexander asked, his tone cold. "Just checking on my favorite sibling," Marcus replied with fake concern. "You look pale. Rough night?" His eyes shifted toward Clare, who was now clearing another table, and his smirk widened. "She's cute, but not your usual type. Too ordinary, don't you think?" Alexander's jaw tightened, his protective instincts flaring. "Stay out of it," he warned, his voice sharp and dangerous. Marcus raised his hands in mock surrender, laughing, as he walked away, but not without leaving a sting behind. Alexander's gaze returned to Clare, watching her move with quiet determination, her focus unbroken despite the stares she surely felt. She laughed softly at something another waitress said, the sound light and uncalculated, and Alexander's chest tightened in a way he hadn't expected. He sipped his whiskey. the burn grounding him, yet his mind spun with possibilities. For weeks he had been thinking of contracts, surrogates, cold clinical arrangements to secure his legacy. But now, staring at Clare Bennett, he saw a possibility he hadn't considered. Not just an heir, not just duty, but something else, something that made him feel alive in the shadow of his diagnosis. By the next morning, Alexander was seated in his penthouse office overlooking Boston Harbor. His investigator, Paul, had worked through the night, and now a slim folder rested on the desk. Inside were details of Clare Bennett's life. She was 26, orphaned at 19, raising her 16-year-old sister Lily in a cramped apartment in East Boston. She worked double shifts at Bella's Diner and picked up catering gigs like last night's gala just to keep them afloat. She had no criminal record, no scandals, nothing but grit and sacrifice etched into her life. Alexander traced a finger over her name, her image in his mind stronger now than the sterile text on paper. She was hard-working, proud, honorable. She was perfect, not just for an heir, but for him. His lips curved into the faintest smile. The pull he had felt wasn't imagined. It was real, dangerous, and undeniable. He had avoided entanglements for years, building walls higher than the skyscrapers he owned. But now, with time slipping away, he wanted more than a contract. He wanted her. That afternoon he found himself standing outside Bella's Diner, a small place with chipped formica tables and the smell of coffee drifting into the street. Through the window he saw Clare moving gracefully between tables, balancing plates and a smile for an elderly regular. She hadn't seen him yet, and for a moment he simply watched, struck by the warmth and resilience in her movements. So different from the sterile world he ruled. Adjusting his tie, Alexander stepped inside. "Clare," he said, his deep voice cutting through the low hum of the diner. Her head snapped up, her hazel eyes narrowing. "You again? Look, if this is about the shirt, I told you I'd pay for it." "It's not about the shirt," Alexander replied smoothly, sliding onto a stool at the counter. "I need to talk to you somewhere private." She glanced at the clock, wary. "My break's in 10 minutes. You buying coffee or just taking up space?" "Coffee. Black," he said with a faint smirk. 10 minutes later, they sat across from each other in a quiet corner booth. The noise of the diner faded into the background as Clare sipped her water, her posture guarded. "So? What's this about? You don't exactly look like the diner type." Alexander leaned forward, his green eyes locking onto hers. "I know about your life, Clare. About Lily. About how hard you've been fighting just to keep the two of you afloat. I had someone look into it." Her face hardened instantly, anger flashing in her eyes. "You had no right to dig into my life. What do you want, Mr. Hayes?" "I want to make you an offer," he said steadily, his voice strong though his heart pounded. "Marry me. Give me a child, an heir. In return, I'll give you and your sister security for life. A home, college for Lily. Everything you've ever needed, forever." The words hung between them like a thunderclap. Clare froze, her glass halfway to her lips, staring at him in disbelief. "You're serious?" she whispered. "You're actually serious?" Alexander nodded, his gaze unwavering. "I don't joke about things like this. I'm running out of time, Clare. And I need someone I can trust, someone real. That's you." Clare stared at Alexander, her pulse racing, unable to believe what she was hearing. A billionaire she had met only once at a hotel gala, was now sitting across from her in a diner, offering marriage and a lifetime of security in exchange for an heir. Her laugh was sharp and disbelieving as she leaned back in the booth. "You don't even know me. I spilled wine on you, and now you want me to be your wife and have your child? This isn't a fairy tale, Mr. Hayes. This is insane." "Maybe it is," Alexander admitted, his green eyes burning into hers. "But I see you, Clare. I see the weight you carry. I see how hard you fight every single day, and I can change that. You give me an heir, and I give you and Lily freedom. You'll never have to struggle again." Her hands trembled as she set her glass down too quickly, the sound of it hitting the table sharp in the quiet corner. You think you can just buy me? I'm not a transaction. I'm not someone you can put a price tag on. That's not what this is, Alexander said, his voice softening for the first time since they sat down. Last night when our hands touched, something happened. I felt it. You felt it too, whether you want to admit it or not. I don't just want an heir, Claire, I want you. Her breath caught, her chest tightening at the intensity in his voice, though her mind screamed at her to push him away. You don't know what you're asking. I have Lily to think about. She's all I have. I know. Alexander replied quietly. That's why I'm offering this. For her future. For you. I'm not asking for love, Claire. I'm asking for a partnership, but I won't lie to you. I felt something last night, and I think you did too. For a moment, her hazel eyes met his, and the memory of his steady hand on hers at the gala returned, unbidden, a spark that lingered like a bruise. She stood abruptly, pacing a step away, her hands twisting the edge of her apron she still wore, beneath her diner uniform. This is insane. I can't just agree to this. I need time to think. Take it, Alexander said, rising as well, his presence towering and unshaken. But don't take too long. Tomorrow night, 8 o'clock. The Seabreeze Hotel. Meet me there if you're in. And if I say no, she asked, her voice wavering. Then you say no, he said softly, almost tenderly. But I don't think you will. He walked away, leaving the faint jingle of the diner door behind him, while Claire sank back into the booth, her mind a storm of fear, temptation, and something deeper she dared not name. She spent the rest of her shift distracted, plates in her hands feeling heavier than usual, every tick of the clock echoing Alexander's words. He had offered her everything she had dreamed of for Lily: security, education, a safe home. But beneath the promise of stability was the man himself, his intensity, his raw vulnerability beneath the steel exterior, and it terrified her as much as it pulled her in. The next night, as the clock struck 8, Claire found herself standing in the lobby of the Seabreeze Hotel, her heart pounding in her chest. The marble floors gleamed under golden lights, and her reflection in the glass doors showed a woman torn between fear and resolve. Driven by desperation and a flicker of something she couldn't deny, she walked toward him. Alexander Hayes stood, waiting, his broad frame immaculate in another perfectly tailored suit, his gaze steady and unreadable until it landed on her. Something in his eyes softened, but his tone remained controlled. You came. Claire lifted her chin, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. I came. And I'll do it. I'll marry you. The weeks that followed blurred into a storm of contracts, lawyers, and discreet planning as Alexander Hayes moved with relentless urgency, every decision shadowed by the ticking clock of the diagnosis he believed was real. Claire Bennett signed papers she barely understood, her heart torn between the desperate need to secure Lily's future and the fear of stepping into a world she didn't belong to. 3 weeks later, she stood in a quiet, elegant chapel on the outskirts of Boston, her simple ivory dress foreign against her skin, her reflection in the mirror showing a woman she barely recognized. She was no longer the exhausted waitress carrying trays at Bella's diner. She was a bride about to marry a billionaire. The chapel was intimate, its wooden pews filled with a select group. Alexander's business associates sat in the back, watching, with reserved curiosity, while a few of Claire's co-workers from the diner filled a row near the front. Lily sat in the very first pew in a new dress Alexander had bought her, her wide eyes a mix of awe and worry, and Claire's heart ached at the sight of her younger sister, the reason she had agreed to this impossible arrangement. Alexander waited at the altar, his black suit cut sharply across his broad shoulders, his green eyes fixed on her with a steady intensity that sent shivers through her despite herself. She forced herself to walk forward, her hands cold, and when she reached him, his grip closed firmly around hers, grounding her against the tremor in her chest. The words of the officiant blurred together into a distant murmur of vows and promises, but Claire felt the quiet claim in the way his hand never left her waist, protective and possessive all at once. In the back pew, Marcus Hayes leaned with a smirk sharp enough to cut, his eyes glittering with contempt as whispers of gold digger passed among the guests. Claire's skin prickled under the weight of their judgment, but when Alexander leaned close, his lips brushed her ear and he whispered, "Ignore him. He's nothing." His voice was a shield, his presence an anchor. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, Alexander kissed her, a deliberate press of lips that sent sparks through her body despite its restraint, and the guests applauded, politely. Marcus's slow, mocking clap cut through the air, his disdain clear, but Alexander's hand never left hers as they walked down the aisle together. The reception followed in a private room at the Seabreeze Hotel, elegant with white linens and a view of Boston Harbor glistening under the evening lights. Clare clutched her champagne flute, every guest's stare making her feel like an actress, on a stage. Alexander stayed close, his hand resting at her waist, his presence steady but colder now, his jaw tight as he scanned the room. At the dessert table, he caught her gaze and said quietly, "This is a deal, Clare. Nothing more. Don't expect hearts and flowers." His words stung sharper than she had expected. She turned to him, her voice low but unflinching. "I don't. I'm here for Lily, just as you're here for your legacy. Let's not pretend it's anything else." Her defiance seemed to surprise him, and for a moment the corner of his lips twitched as if in reluctant respect, before he turned away to greet another guest. Claire's chest burned with confusion. She had known this was a transaction, but the memory of his warmth at the diner clashed violently with the coldness in his words now. She looked at Lily across the room, laughing with one of the waiters, and forced herself to remember why she was here. This was for her sister, not for fairy tales. Marcus appeared at her side with a glass of whiskey in hand, his oily smile making her skin crawl. "Mrs. Hayes," he said mockingly, "quite the leap from pouring coffee to playing society wife. Hope you're ready for the spotlight." Claire's grip tightened on her glass, her eyes sharp. "I'm ready for whatever comes. You, on the other hand, look like you're trying too hard to matter." His smile faltered, irritation flashing across his face. "Careful, sweetheart. You're playing in a world you don't understand." Before she could respond, Alexander appeared, his hand firm on her waist, his tone a low warning. "Marcus, find someone else to bother." Marcus raised his glass with a smirk, backing away slowly. "Just welcoming the new family, brother. She's charming." His voice dripped, venom, but he vanished into the crowd. Claire turned to Alexander, her voice barely a whisper. "He thinks I'm after your money. Half the room probably does." "Let them," Alexander replied sharply, though his eyes softened as they met hers. "You know why you're here, and so do I. That's all that matters. You're stronger than they think, Claire." His thumb brushed her waist briefly, a gesture more intimate than his kiss at the altar, leaving her breathless and unsteady. As the night wound down, she stepped out onto the balcony for air, the cool harbor breeze wrapping around her. Alexander joined her, his presence quiet but grounding. "You okay?" he asked, his voice softer now. "I don't know," she admitted honestly. "This is a lot. You say it's just a deal, but then you look at me like—" She trailed off, unsure. "Like what?" he pressed, his jaw tight. "Like you see me," she whispered, her voice almost breaking. "Not just the deal." He didn't answer, but his hand slid into hers, his thumb brushing her knuckles in a gesture that betrayed more than words. Inside, the crowd dwindled, and soon Alexander led her toward the private elevator that carried them up to his penthouse suite. As the doors closed and silence wrapped around them, Claire's pulse raced. She was no longer just Claire Bennett, waitress and sister. She was Clare Hayes, wife of Alexander Hayes, billionaire heir to a legacy. And though he insisted it was only a deal, the way his hand lingered in hers told a story she wasn't sure she was ready to believe. The elevator doors opened to the private penthouse and the lights of Boston spilled across the glass walls, the city glittering like 1,000 watchful eyes. Claire stepped inside cautiously, the ivory fabric of her gown brushing against the sleek floor while Alexander walked ahead with deliberate calm. He poured a glass of water at the bar, his movements controlled yet strained, his jaw tight as, if rebuilding the walls he had let slip during the wedding. "You should rest," he said flatly. "It's been a long day." Clare watched him carefully, her heart still racing from the balcony and the way his hand had lingered on hers. "You're the one who looks like he needs rest," she said, softly. "You're pale, Alexander. Are you sure you're all right?" He froze for a fraction of a second, his hand gripping the edge of the counter too tightly. "I'm fine," he said, but the words were brittle. A sudden weakness pulled at him and he swayed, catching himself just before collapsing. Clare rushed forward, steadying his arm and guiding him onto the sofa, her voice calm but firm. "Sit down. Don't argue with me." His green eyes clouded, vulnerability seeping through his usual control. She knelt beside him, her hand resting on his arm. "It's one of those spells, isn't it?" she asked quietly. He nodded once, his jaw clenched, trying to dismiss it, but his hand trembled as he reached for the water. She took the glass, held it to his lips, and steadied his hand with her own. Their eyes met, and for a moment the room felt smaller. The world narrowed to just the two of them. "You don't have to hide it from me," she whispered. "Deal or no deal, I'm here." Something broke in his gaze, a raw, unguarded look of a man who had carried too much alone. "You don't know what you're saying," he muttered, but he didn't pull away. The space between them seemed to shrink until the air pulsed with unspoken desire. Claire's heart thudded as her own words surprised her. "I know enough. You're not just a billionaire, Alexander. You're human." Her touch moved from his, arm to his cheek, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw, and his breath caught. He reached for her, his hand cupping her face, his thumb grazing her skin. "Clare," he whispered, her name carrying the weight of a confession. And then he kissed her. It was not the restrained formality of the ceremony, but a searching, hungry kiss that stole her breath. She leaned into him, her fingers splaying across his chest to feel the rapid beat of his heart. The kiss deepened, and Alexander pulled her closer, his hand sliding to her waist as he lifted her onto his lap. The ivory gown bunched around her thighs, but neither of them cared. Her hands tangled in his hair as his lips trailed down to her neck, a low groan escaping him as he buried his face against her skin. "I shouldn't want this," he murmured, his voice breaking. "But you do," she whispered back, her lips brushing his ear. "And so do I." The fragile restraint shattered. Alexander rose, carrying her effortlessly in his arms, their lips never parting as he moved toward the bedroom. The city lights glowed through the towering windows, casting them in silver and shadow as he laid her on the bed. Their movements became urgent yet tender, a collision of need and vulnerability. Her dress slipped away, his shirt followed, and their skin met with a heat that burned away all pretense. Every touch was a discovery. His hands traced her body with reverence, his whispers of disbelief breaking through his usual control. "You're more than I deserve," he breathed against her lips. She pulled him closer, her body answering his with a fierce need that left no space for doubt. The night unfolded in a rush of passion, each kiss deeper, each caress more desperate, until they were tangled in the sheets, the weight of their agreement forgotten in the fire between them. For the first time since his diagnosis, Alexander felt alive, not as a man racing against time, but as a man consumed by love and desire. Afterward, he held her in the quiet, his arm wrapped around her, his hand tracing lazy patterns on her back. His voice was low, almost a whisper. "This wasn't supposed to happen, not like this." Clare pressed her cheek to his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heart. "Maybe it was," she whispered back. "Maybe we're more than a deal." Alexander tightened his hold around her, his silence heavy but not cold. He did not answer, but the way his arm stayed locked around her body spoke louder than words. The shadow of his diagnosis still loomed, but for one night in Clare's arms he felt like a man who had finally found something worth living for. Morning light spilled across the penthouse windows and Clare stirred beneath the sheets, her hand reaching instinctively for the warmth she had felt hours ago. The bed was cold, She sat up quickly, pulling Alexander's discarded shirt around her shoulders, and found him standing in the living room with a mug of coffee in his hand, staring out at the harbor, as if the world beyond the glass could swallow him whole. His posture was rigid, his face set in the controlled mask she was beginning to recognize, the mask he wore whenever he wanted to bury something deeper. "Good morning," she said softly. He turned, his green eyes softening for a brief instant before hardening again. "We should talk about logistics," he said flatly. "The doctor's visit is tomorrow. We need to confirm progress." The words cut her like a blade, so clinical, so cold after the tenderness of the night they had shared. She swallowed the ache in her throat, unsure whether to challenge him or let him retreat into his armor. Before she could answer, a knock sounded at the door. Julia Adams, his assistant, stepped in with her tablet glowing in her hands. "Your mother is in town," she said, glancing curiously at Claire. "She wants to meet you both for lunch today, and Marcus has been calling nonstop about the wedding." Alexander's jaw tightened as if the weight of those names alone was enough to darken the morning. "Tell Marcus to mind his own business. And my mother." He sighed, rubbing his temple. "Set it up. 1 o'clock. Claire's stomach clenched. She had heard of Victoria Hayes, Alexander's mother, the formidable socialite whose reputation was built on philanthropy and iron-fisted control. Claire had seen her photo in the background file Paul had put together. A striking woman, with sharp cheekbones, colder eyes, and a reputation that made even seasoned businessmen tread carefully. The idea of sitting across from her felt like stepping into a lion's den. At 1 o'clock sharp, they arrived at an exclusive restaurant overlooking Boston Harbor, the kind of place where the tablecloths gleamed white and the glasses sparkled like crystal under perfect light. Victoria Hayes sat at the head of the table, her silver hair immaculate, her smile cutting as she looked up at her son and his new wife. Marcus lounged beside her, his expression already smirking with disdain. "Claire, is it?" Victoria said, smoothly, her tone laced with judgment. "You've certainly moved up quickly, from waitress to Mrs. Hayes in what, a month?" Claire's cheeks flushed, but she forced her voice steady. "I'm here for Alexander, not for a title." Marcus laughed into his glass, swirling the amber liquid lazily. "Come on, Claire, do you really expect us to believe this isn't about the money? My brother's got a ticking clock and you're perfectly positioned to cash in." Alexander's hand closed tightly around Claire's knee beneath the table, his grip grounding her, his voice low and dangerous. "Enough, Marcus." But Marcus leaned closer, his words dripping poison. "You're just a means to an end, sweetheart. He's using you for an heir. You think he cares? I could give you a better life, real attention, not just a contract." Claire's blood boiled, and she shot him a glare sharp enough to slice through his smugness. "I'd rather scrape by at the diner than ever take anything from you. You're not half the man Alexander is." For the first time, Marcus's smile faltered. But before he could respond, Victoria's laughter cut through, cool and sharp. "Fiery," she said with a mocking tilt of her head. "I'll give you that. But you're out of your depth, darling. Alexander's world chews up girls like you. A diner girl pretending to belong in our world. It's almost comical. So..." Restaurants seemed to hush, heads turning, eyes shifting toward their table. Claire's face burned as humiliation twisted in her stomach. She opened her mouth to defend herself, but before she could, Alexander's chair scraped back. He rose, his voice a low growl that silenced the entire room. "That's enough, Mother. Claire is my wife. She's worth more than any of you deserve, more than I deserve, and you don't get to speak to her like that. Not now, not ever." The air crackled. Victoria's composure slipped for only a moment, her sharp eyes flashing as if someone had dared to wound her pride. Marcus stared at his brother with barely veiled hatred. Claire's breath caught, her heart racing at Alexander's fierce defense. He reached for her hand, pulling her to her feet. "We're done here," he said with finality, leading her away as whispers followed them. Outside, the breeze off the harbor was cool, but Alexander's grip was warm and urgent. He stopped, turning to face her, his eyes searching hers with intensity. "I'm sorry," he said roughly. "They're vultures, both of them. You didn't deserve that." Claire's throat tightened, her voice barely steady. "You didn't have to do that. You didn't have to defend me like that." "Yes, I did," he said firmly, his hand rising to cup her face. "You're not just a deal to me, Claire. Not anymore." The confession hit her like a wave, her heart pounding against her ribs. She wanted to ask about his illness, about the walls he kept building and breaking, but his touch silenced her doubts. She leaned against his chest, her forehead resting, where his heartbeat thudded fast and strong. "I don't know what we're doing, Alexander," she whispered, her voice trembling. "But I'm scared. I think I'm falling for you." He didn't answer, but his arms tightened around her, his silence heavy with meaning. She could feel it, his fear, his restraint, and the possibility of something bigger than both of them. The sting of humiliation from Victoria's words and Marcus's venom lingered, but Alexander's fierce defense had lit a spark in her that she couldn't ignore. Weeks later, Claire sat in the penthouse bathroom, her hands trembling as she stared at the pregnancy test on the counter. 2 pink lines glowed back at her, and her heart raced with a mix of fear and joy. She was pregnant. The weight of it pressed down on her chest. This was the cornerstone of their agreement, the heir Alexander wanted, but it was also something deeper, something that tied her to him in a way she had not expected. She tucked the test into her pocket, her mind swirling with his words on the harbor after defending her from his family. "You're not just a deal to me." Could she trust that? Could she believe in it? When she found him in his office, his desk was scattered with papers, his focus sharp and cold as ever. She stood at the door for a moment, watching the man who had become both her protector and her greatest uncertainty. Taking a breath, she stepped forward, pulled the test from her pocket, and set it down on the desk. "I'm pregnant," she said quietly. Alexander froze, his green eyes locked on the test, and for a long moment he said nothing. Then a raw, unguarded smile broke across his face, transforming him into someone younger, lighter, almost free. "Claire," he whispered, rising to his feet and crossing the room to pull her into his arms. "We did it. You gave me everything I wanted." His voice cracked with joy and relief, though something darker flickered behind his eyes. He kissed her forehead, his hands framing her face, and for that brief moment he seemed reborn. "You're happy," she whispered, her eyes searching his face. "But you're still scared, aren't you? Scared because of your illness." His smile faltered. His hands dropped to her shoulders and his eyes hardened again. "I'm fine," he said too quickly, shutting the door on her question. "Let's focus on this, on you, on the baby." His deflection stung. She wanted to push, to demand the truth, but the warmth in his embrace stopped her. She nodded, forcing herself to let the moment pass, though unease sat in her chest like a stone. Days. Later at the hospital, Claire waited in the lobby while Alexander met with Dr. Miller for one of his private updates. Her hand rested protectively on her stomach, still flat, but now a secret she carried with every breath. The longer she sat, the more uneasy she felt, and when 2 doctors passed by, speaking in hushed voices, her world tilted. "Harris is still pushing the degenerative illness narrative," one doctor muttered, "but the scans don't add up. Hayes's symptoms look like stress, not terminal disease." "Dr. Miller owes someone big," the other replied. "Could be the brother. Marcus has been sniffing around." Claire's blood ran cold. She leaned back, hidden behind a plant, her heart pounding as their words crashed through her mind. Could it be possible? Was Alexander's diagnosis a lie? Was Marcus behind it all, manipulating scans to steal what his brother had built? The thought made her stomach twist, rage and fear colliding with sudden relief. If it was true, Alexander wasn't dying. He wasn't on borrowed time. He had a future. That night, while Alexander was at a late meeting, Claire drove to Greenwich to see Dr. Catherine Ross, a physician known for her independence and discretion. She handed over Alexander's medical records, files she had convinced Julia to slip to her, and waited in silence as the doctor studied them. "Mrs. Hayes?" Dr. Ross said finally, her tone calm but firm. "Your husband's scans have been manipulated. His symptoms are consistent with stress, exhaustion, perhaps dehydration. But there is no evidence of a degenerative disease. Someone wanted him to believe he was dying." Claire's breath caught. Relief surged through her chest, but it was tangled with fury. Marcus. His name burned in her thoughts, his smirks, his taunts, his whisper at the wedding reception that she was nothing but a pawn. Now she saw the truth. He was trying to break Alexander from the inside out. She drove back to Boston with her hands gripping the wheel, torn between confronting Alexander immediately and finding proof that Marcus was behind it all. When she entered the penthouse, Alexander was waiting, his tie loosened, his eyes soft but shadowed. "You're late," he said, brushing a hand down her arm. "Is everything all right?" She forced a smile, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. "I just needed air," she replied. He pulled her close, his warmth grounding her even as the weight of her secret pressed on her chest. She laid a hand on her stomach, the life inside her anchoring her resolve. She would protect Alexander, their child, and the fragile love growing between them. But first she needed proof, hard evidence to destroy Marcus Hayes once and for all. The next morning, Claire woke to the smell of coffee and found Alexander at the kitchen island, his laptop open, his brow furrowed in concentration. The man she had held in her arms the night before was gone, replaced once again by the guarded billionaire who hid behind business and control. "You're up early," he said, glancing at her, his green eyes softening for a brief second before hardening. Again, "Everything all right?" She forced a smile, her throat tight. "Just restless," she answered, repeating the same excuse she had used the night before. Inside, the weight of Dr. Ross's words pressed against her like a secret she could barely contain. She kissed his cheek quickly and left, claiming errands, but her real destination was a small cafe in East Boston where she met Paul, Alexander's trusted investigator. Paul looked uneasy when she asked for his help, but her determination broke through his hesitation. "I need you to dig into Marcus Hayes," she said firmly, discreetly. "I think he's the one paying Dr. Miller to lie to Alexander." Paul hesitated, then nodded, his loyalty to Alexander and his quiet respect for Clare winning out. By evening, he delivered an envelope into her trembling hands. Inside were bank records, emails, and a recording. Marcus's voice speaking to Dr. Miller, telling him to make the diagnosis convincing so Alexander would believe he was dying. Claire's breath caught as fury and relief tangled together in her chest. The proof was undeniable. That night, she walked into the penthouse, her step steady despite her racing heart. Alexander was pacing the living room, his phone pressed to his ear, his voice sharp as he barked orders about a board meeting. He hung up and turned toward her, his eyes narrowing. "What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." Claire placed the envelope on the coffee table. "We need to talk now." Alexander frowned, confused, but she opened the envelope and slid the documents across to him. "This is about your diagnosis. It isn't real. Dr. Ross reviewed your files. The scans were altered. Your symptoms are stress, nothing more. Marcus paid Dr. Miller to make you think you were dying so he could steal everything from you." For a moment, Alexander just stared at her, his face unreadable. Then he grabbed the papers, his hands trembling as he scanned the evidence. When the recording played and Marcus's voice filled the room, clear and cruel, Alexander's face paled, his jaw clenched as the truth sank in. "No," he whispered, his voice breaking. "All this time I thought—" He dropped into the sofa, his chest rising and falling heavily. He looked up at Claire, his green eyes raw and betrayed. "I built my life around a lie." Claire knelt beside him, her hand resting on his. "I'm sorry, Alexander. I had to know the truth. For you, for us, for the baby." Her hand drifted instinctively to her stomach and his eyes followed, softening briefly before filling again with rage. The door burst open before he could respond. Marcus stormed inside, his face twisted with fury. "You little witch!" he spat at Clare. "You couldn't leave it alone, could you? You had to dig into things that weren't your business." Clare stood her ground, her heart pounding but her voice steady. "You tried to destroy him, Marcus, your own brother. For what, money, power?" Marcus laughed harshly. "You think you've saved him? You're nothing but a pawn. A diner girl who got lucky. You've ruined everything." In a sudden motion, he lunged, his hand swinging toward Clare's face. She flinched as his fingers grazed her cheek, leaving a sting behind. Time seemed to stop, her hand flying to the mark, shock freezing her in place. Alexander roared with a fury that shook the walls. He surged to his feet, grabbing Marcus by the collar and slamming him against the wall. "Touch her again and you're finished," he snarled, his voice like steel. "You're nothing, Marcus, nothing but a coward who sells out his own blood." Marcus struggled, fear flashing for the first time in his eyes, but still he sneered. "You think you've won? You'll always be the weak one. Heir or no heir. You'll never be free." Alexander's arm tightened protectively around Clare, pulling her to his side. "Get out," he said with deadly calm. "If I ever see you near my wife again, you'll wish you were never born." Marcus stumbled back, his eyes darting between them before he fled, the slam of the door echoing in his wake. Clare's breath trembled, her cheek stinging where he had struck her, but Alexander's hand was already there, gentle and protective, brushing over the faint red mark. "He'll never touch you again," he vowed, his voice low and fierce. "No one will." Tears welled in Clare's eyes, not from pain, but from the depth of his promise. "I was so scared," she admitted, her voice breaking. "Not of him, of losing you, of this being a lie." Alexander pulled her into his arms, his forehead resting against hers. "It's not a lie," he whispered, his voice raw. "You, the baby, us. This is real. More real than anything I've ever known." Clare clung to Alexander as the echo of Marcus's departure faded, her cheek still burning from the strike, but her heart pounding harder from the raw protectiveness in Alexander's eyes. He brushed his fingers carefully over the faint mark on her face, his touch gentle where his fury had been violent moments before. "You saved me," he whispered, his voice rough. "Not just from him, but from myself. I was dying inside long before Marcus tried to convince me otherwise, building an empire, shutting everyone out, believing control was enough. And then you came." His voice cracked as his green eyes locked onto hers, unguarded and vulnerable. "The doctor said I was dying, but you gave me a reason to live. You didn't just give me an heir, Clare. You gave me the greatest romance of my life." Her throat tightened, her eyes filling as the last of her doubts dissolved. "Alexander, I didn't expect to love you. I tried to tell myself this was only about Lily, only about survival, but somewhere along the way I fell. I love you. I think I have for a while." The confession broke something in him. His lips found hers in a kiss that was neither restrained, nor desperate but deep, deliberate. A promise carved into every touch. He lifted her effortlessly and carried her to their bedroom, their mouths never parting as the city lights painted their skin in silver and shadow. He laid her on the bed, with reverence, his hand sliding over her body not as a claim but as worship. "You're everything I never knew I needed," he murmured against her skin as her fingers tangled in his hair. The night became a dance of devotion, their bodies moving with a rhythm that spoke of love rather than urgency, of belonging rather than need. Every kiss was a vow, every caress a confession. "I love you," he whispered again and again, and she believed it with every fiber of her being. Their passion burned and softened until they collapsed together, tangled in the sheets, their fingers entwined as if neither could bear to let go. Later, as the city hummed beyond the glass walls, Clare rested her head on his chest and listened to the steady beat of his heart. "I feel safe with you," she whispered, "like I can finally breathe." You are safe, Alexander said firmly, his lips brushing her forehead. You, the baby, us. This is my world now, and I'll spend my life protecting it. For the first time in years, his words were not about business or legacy. They were about love. Claire closed her eyes, letting the warmth of his promise fill her, though in the back of her mind, the shadow of Marcus lingered. His rage, his hatred, his vow to ruin them, it was not gone. But tonight she chose to believe in Alexander, in their love, in the family growing inside her. Weeks passed and Alexander struck with ruthless precision. With Paul's help, he presented the damning evidence to the board of Hayes International. Marcus was exposed in front of the very men and women he had hoped to manipulate, his smirk faltering as the recording played. His name dragged through scandal. His inheritance and his stake in the empire were stripped away, his influence erased in a single meeting. He was escorted out of the boardroom in disgrace, his threats silenced by the slamming of the doors. Dr. Miller faced his own destruction. The ethics board stripped him of his license after the truth of his falsified scans came to light. His reputation shattered across Boston's news outlets. He became a cautionary tale of greed, while Alexander reclaimed his empire, stronger than before. But victory felt hollow without Claire by his side. She was now heavily pregnant, her body carrying the proof of their love, her presence softening the steel edges of his life. They moved into an estate outside Boston, its gardens a sanctuary where she could breathe, away from the city and its shadows. Alexander found himself waking early to check on her, his once rigid schedule softened by stolen moments in the kitchen, laughter in the garden, and quiet nights where her head rested on his chest as their unborn child shifted within. Her one spring morning when blossoms drifted across the lawn, Claire went into labor. Alexander drove her to the hospital, gripping her hand tightly, his green eyes bright with nerves and wonder. "You've got this," he whispered fiercely. "We've got this." Hours later, their son was born, a healthy boy with Alexander's piercing green eyes and Claire's stubborn chin. Tears streamed down Alexander's face as he cradled the tiny bundle. "Liam Hayes," he said softly, his voice breaking with emotion. "Our boy." Claire, exhausted but radiant, reached for his hand. "Look at him," she whispered. "He's perfect." Alexander kissed her forehead, then the baby's, his heart remade in an instant. "You gave me everything," he told her, his voice raw. "Not just him, but you." They returned home to the estate, where Liam's laughter and cries filled the halls, transforming Alexander from a man obsessed with control into a husband and father who lived for stolen moments and the warmth of his family. He changed diapers, sang lullabies off-key, and found joy in dancing with Claire in the kitchen while Liam slept against her chest. The empire still called, but he learned to delegate, his priorities reshaped. He no longer lived for legacy alone. He lived for them. Months passed, and the Hayes estate transformed from a cold monument of wealth into a home filled with warmth and laughter. Claire's days were spent caring for Liam, her heart swelling each time his tiny hands clutched her finger or his giggles echoed across the garden. Alexander often slipped away from meetings early, ignoring board members who reminded him of stock reports and acquisitions because nothing mattered more than returning home to see his wife and son. For the first time in his life, he understood what peace felt like. One golden afternoon, Claire sat beneath the blooming cherry tree. Liam nestled in her arms while the sun painted the sky in shades of rose and gold. Alexander walked toward them across the grass, his suit jacket discarded, his shirt sleeves rolled, his green eyes softened by the sight before him. She looked up and smiled, her hazel eyes glowing, and he knew in that moment he would never again trade this for any empire. He lowered himself beside her, brushing his fingers across Liam's dark hair. "Every time I look at him, I still can't believe he's ours," he whispered. Claire rested her head on his shoulder, her voice gentle. "He's everything we dreamed of and more." Alexander kissed the crown of her head, his gaze lingering on the horizon. "You know, when I thought I was dying, I believed legacy was all that mattered. I thought buildings, contracts, and power were the only way to prove I existed. But I was wrong. This," he gestured to her and Liam, This is my legacy. You are my forever. Tears filled Claire's eyes as she shifted Liam carefully and cupped Alexander's cheek. You're more than I ever thought I'd have. You saved me and Lily, and now you've given us a future. I love you, Alexander Hayes. He leaned in and kissed her deeply, a kiss not of urgency, but of permanence, one that sealed every vow they had ever spoken. When they pulled back, Liam stirred, blinking up at them with his father's piercing green eyes, and Alexander laughed softly. I think he knows, he murmured. Their nights were no longer silent and lonely. Sometimes Liam cried at 3 a.m, and Alexander would rise first, cradling his son against his chest while whispering stories of the world he would one day inherit. Clare often stood at the doorway watching, her heart swelling at the sight of the powerful man who once hid behind walls of steel, now softened by fatherhood, his empire no longer his only purpose. Even Lily, once hardened by loss and struggle, began to bloom in this new life. With Alexander's support, she enrolled in college, her future secured. She adored Liam, spending her afternoons playing with him and teasing Clare about motherhood. For the first time since her parents' death, she felt free of fear. Marcus faded from their world, his downfall swift and merciless. Stripped of power and wealth, he became a ghost in Boston's elite circles, his name spoken only in whispers as a warning of greed. Dr. Miller disappeared into obscurity, his license revoked, his betrayal sealing his fate. Neither man could touch the life Alexander and Clare had built, a life stronger than any lie. One evening, as the fire crackled in the estate's grand living room, Alexander lifted a glass of wine and handed it to Clare. Liam slept upstairs, the house quiet, the storm of the past finally gone. Do you ever think about how it all began? He asked, a faint smile tugging at his lips. A spilled tray of wine, a deal made in desperation, a diagnosis that wasn't real. I was a man ready to die, and then you appeared. Clare laughed softly, curling into his side. And you thought you could just buy me with contracts and promises. You had no idea you were the one being saved. He kissed her temple, his voice warm. You're right. You saved me, Clare. You gave me a reason to fight, to live, to believe in more than steel and glass towers. You gave me love. She looked up at him, her eyes shining. And you gave me everything I never thought I deserved. You gave me us. He kissed her again, slow and tender, their hands entwined as if the world could never break them apart. Outside, the windows of the estate glowed under a canopy of stars, the future stretching wide before them, no longer shadowed by fear or lies. Together they had faced betrayal, cruelty, and loss. But they had risen stronger, bound not by contracts, but by love. And as Alexander held Clare close, with their son sleeping upstairs and their future secured, he knew that the empire he had built meant nothing compared to the family he had found. His legacy was not his wealth or his name. His legacy was love.